A few years ago, my parents forced me to join a class trip to the Lapland Mountains in Finland. For me, this trip was nothing short of a disaster. I had never been good at socializing, let alone spending several days trekking through the wilderness with 30 classmates. My ideal life was staying at home, sitting in front of a computer, communicating through a microphone and screen without having to endure the anxiety of direct eye contact. The fresh air in Finland will be good for you. They always said that, as if fresh air could cure everything. But for me, the pressure of social interaction was far more suffocating than the thinness of the mountain air. From the moment we departed, I tried my best to keep myself on the outskirts of the group. I sat in the very last row of the bus, plugged in my earphones, and attempted to shut out the world. But even through the music, I could still hear my classmates' laughter, especially the social butterflies, effortlessly blending into conversations while I pretended to sleep, avoiding everything. "Max, try this. It's amazing Finnish chocolate." A voice called from the front row. I glanced up. It was Felix. He was always friendly, but I could only manage a stiff smile and shake my head. "No, thanks," I mumbled, immediately retreating into my seat as if the air itself had grown heavier. The first 2 days of the trip were just as awful as I had expected. Trudging through the damp, cold tundra, I deliberately lagged behind the group. Occasionally, I would hear the sound of approaching footsteps, our teachers, followed by her awkward yet well-meaning question. "Max, are you okay? Maybe try to keep up a little?" I nodded, feigning composure, but deep down, all I wanted was to escape this uncomfortable conversation. The other students seemed to share an unspoken agreement to ignore my presence as if I were invisible. Yet, I had to admit, the scenery was breathtaking. The twisted birch trees stood like ghosts, their white branches curling in eerie shapes. The ground beneath us was covered in damp moss, and in the distance, heather flowers bloomed in deep purple patches, glowing faintly under the autumn light. Towering mountains loomed on either side, silently observing us, as if judging our presence in their domain. The cold air seeped through the seams of my jacket, biting into my bones, yet somehow, it made me feel strangely awake. If only these people weren't here, I might have actually liked this place. Finally, on the third day, I dragged my weary steps, falling to the very back of the group. The sun had long since set, and we walked through the deep blue twilight unique to Finland. Up ahead, our destination came into view, a cluster of lonely wooden cabins, surrounded by an endless wilderness, shrouded in an eerie silence. The campsite was larger than I had expected. There were several cabins, a designated camping area, and an old main lodge that looked like it had stood there for decades. And yet, despite its size, the place felt strangely out of place, as if these buildings were never meant to exist here. By the time we arrived, the other students had already gathered in the common area, chatting animatedly over dinner, reliving amusing moments from the hike. I, however, was pulled aside by the teacher to eat separately. She set down her spoon and smiled at me. "Max, this entire campsite is reserved just for us. So tonight, it's just the 30 of you students, the 2 teachers, and the endless mountains and forests." She emphasized the last few words, likely hoping to lighten my mood. I managed a weak smile in return. After dinner, I quickly retreated to my room, shut the door, and buried myself under the blankets, waiting for my roommates to fall asleep. Fortunately, the day's exhausting trek had drained me, and I soon slipped into darkness. At midnight, I jolted awake, my heart pounding. The room was deathly silent, but something was wrong. The darkness was too thick, unnaturally so. Normally, the hallway lights would cast a faint glow beneath the door. Moonlight should have filtered through the windows, or at least the soft glow of electronics should have been visible. But now, the entire room was swallowed by an abyss of pitch-black nothingness. Even worse, I felt an overwhelming sensation, someone was watching me. The feeling sent a wave of chills down my spine. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. Fear surged through me like a tidal wave, and I desperately told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of exhaustion. Yet, my fingers instinctively clenched the blanket tighter. I strained my ears, listening for any abnormal sounds. But the room was terrifyingly quiet, so quiet that the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing echoing inside my head. I wanted to turn on the light, but what if I woke my roommates? Or worse, what if there really was someone standing in the dark? I hesitated, paralyzed by indecision, until finally, I resolved to slip out quietly. The hallway lights should still be on. At least then, I would be able to see what was inside my room. I carefully sat up, my toes tentatively touching the floor. It was so cold that a shiver ran through me. I reached for my shoes and, moving quietly, tiptoed toward the door, slowly pushing it open. The dim glow from the hallway spilled in, and I turned back to glance at the room, empty. My heart slowed slightly. Maybe I was just overthinking. I walked into the bathroom, but as soon as I stepped inside, a cold gust of air rushed toward me. I shuddered involuntarily, then noticed the window was wide open, the thin curtain trembling in the night breeze. I frowned. Who would open a window on a freezing October night in Finland? That chill, it wasn't just from the air. It carried something deeper, something unsettling. I stepped up to the window and looked out into the night sky. The next second, my breath caught in my throat. Above the distant mountains, a faint green glow slowly unfurled, gliding across the heavens like a ghostly specter. The northern lights? My heartbeat gradually steadied, excitement replacing my earlier fear. I hurried back to my room, grabbed my phone and jacket, eager to capture the moment. This might be the only memory worth keeping from this trip. For a brief moment, I debated waking the others, but dismissed the idea. If they had seen it first, they wouldn't have woken me, so why should I? A thin layer of frost covered the ground, glistening eerily under the aurora's glow. Though faint, there was no mistaking it. This was the northern lights. Nothing else could look quite like it. I was mesmerized by the beauty of the night until the cold began to seep into my bones. Reluctantly, I decided to head back before I risked frostbite. Not wanting the hallway lights to disrupt the peacefulness of the night, I returned to my room in the dark, collapsed onto my bed, and quickly fell asleep. When I opened my eyes again, the sky outside was already a pale gray. I reached for my phone, but the time on the screen sent a jolt of unease through me. 10:30. Shit, I muttered under my breath, throwing off my covers. But then I noticed something odd. All the beds were empty. Neatly made, with no signs of anyone having slept in them. I walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains. Outside, the landscape was still shrouded in that cold, gray haze. But something felt wrong. The campground was completely empty. Last night, this place had been filled with noise and movement. Now, it was disturbingly silent. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway. Nothing. No footsteps, no laughter. Just an oppressive, hollow stillness. I knocked on the door of the next room. No answer. A deep, creeping unease began to claw at my stomach. I made my way to the main hall. The dining area door was slightly ajar, its dim lighting casting long shadows. I stepped inside. The tables were perfectly set, plates covered neatly with thin plastic wrap. My stomach twisted. Breakfast had never been touched. I staggered into the kitchen, yanked open the fridge, and found all the food untouched, perfectly intact, even last night's dinner, neatly arranged as if no one had touched it. What the hell is going on? My voice echoed sharply in the empty kitchen. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, then turned and rushed toward the nearest dormitory. My hands trembled as I grasped the doorknob and slowly twisted it open. Peter lay silently on his bed, his face pale, his eyes closed. I called his name softly, no response. Summoning my courage, I reached out and touched his arm. Cold. Stiff. A lump formed in my throat, and terror quickly devoured the last remnants of my rationality. I stumbled back, then bolted to the other rooms, flinging open doors. They were all the same. Every single student lay in bed, their expressions serene, as if simply asleep. But their bodies, they were all ice cold. I forced myself to stay calm, my legs trembling as I dragged myself toward the main lodge, desperate to find the teachers. But inside, the building was empty. Everyone's belongings were still there, untouched, yet the people themselves, gone. My phone. With shaking fingers, I yanked it from my pocket and frantically dialed emergency services. No signal. My breath hitched, eyes wide in disbelief. I have to get out of here. I burst out of the cabin, sprinting through the campsite, heading toward the nearest hill. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. The freezing wind cut my face like razor blades. My shoes skidded on the slick moss, nearly sending me tumbling multiple times. Finally, as I reached the top of a small hill, my phone's signal returned. I gasped for breath, fingers trembling as I dialed again. This time, the call went through. A voice crackled on the other end. I barely had time to relay our location before the line was abruptly cut off. A loud burst of static. Then, my phone shut down completely. I froze. Slowly, my gaze drifted back toward the camp below. In the pale morning light, the ground around the cabins came into focus, a perfect, charred circle surrounding the site. As if something had burned it into the earth. The police arrived soon after, sealing off the entire area. Their official report was brief: carbon monoxide poisoning. All students and teachers had died in their sleep due to oxygen deprivation. But I knew the truth was far from that. When I tried to describe what had happened the night before, the officers exchanged brief glances before dismissing it. They simply offered vague reassurances, telling me it was likely a stress-induced hallucination. Yet just before I left, an older officer pulled me aside and muttered something under his breath. "Kid, you shouldn't have stayed in these mountains for so long." His words sent a deep chill down my spine. But what truly terrified me was something else. The final words from the investigating officer. There were no recorded aurora sightings in Lapland last night. I never went on another school trip again.